Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for CalicoCon session on supply chain security. It's our pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to having the discussion on this new concept of supply chain security with respect to the CI/CD pipeline. With me, I have the subject matter expert in this area who has been working very closely with the CISOs of the top enterprises and anyone who is disrupting their industry out there with this concept. So with that, let me introduce Saikat. Saikat, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Saikat Maiti. I am a senior director at Salesforce, and I focus on information security. Prior to Salesforce, I've spent many years as the CISO at cloud-first companies such as Upstart and Personal Capital, and I have built large-scale security programs that have helped companies get better at information security over a period of time. With that, today specifically, I will talk about how a new area of security has been brought into focus, which involves the ability for companies to manage and track all elements or components of the software that they use so as to avoid people from getting backdoors and other compromised components into their environment and products and creating problems from a cybersecurity standpoint. So that's going to be our focus for our discussion today. Thank you, Dheeraj, for getting me out here for this discussion.
Thank you, Saikat. So before we get started, Saikat, would you like to tell us a little bit about what has been happening in the security world, what you have been working on, what you are seeing in the market?
Absolutely. I think there are few things that have been going on in the security world. I think we have seen large-scale compromises stem from our inability to stop attack vectors coming in through third-party components and other vendor-driven components in this increasingly vendor-driven world. In an analysis that we did recently, it was found that even medium to small companies use 150 to 200 SaaS providers to build a solution and take it to market. And if you think about the larger companies, we are talking thousands of providers coming together and providing their solutions brought into the format of a product that the company launches. Along with that, if you talk to any developer, they will tell you 90% of the code today is reused from open source components that are available outside. And pretty much, nobody wants to write something that has already been written. Nobody wants to build something that is already working. And that's a great thing. That's what keeps us going in this world and keeps the time to market low, the cost low. But it also increases a lot of risk. And this got highlighted at a variety of different areas, including the recent Solarwinds attacks that we saw, and then a variety of other attacks that came up. So much so that the executive order that Biden had created in May 2021 explicitly required every federal agency to use a software bill of materials as the baseline for how they build, test, secure, and operate the software applications. This order applies to any organization who wants to do business with the federal government. So it has become that important that we monitor our supply chain and our open source elements for vulnerabilities and backdoors and manage to that. So this is a fairly hot topic. Now, what has become even more important is that how do you bring this in an automated way into your continuous integration, continuous development pipelines, your CI/CD pipelines, and manage it such that it doesn't require an army for you to do this. And that's where a whole variety of products have come in, and there's a lot of open source activity going on. And this is something that every company should consider as part of their security program. And every CISO is kind of looking at this as one of the key things to invest in the next few months. So I think that's one of those prominent things. Other than that, there are large-scale trends going on in securing applications better, securing cloud resources better, having a top-notch vendor security program. As I said, most of our landscape is today vendor-driven, so it doesn't surprise me that there's significant investment going on into third-party risk management and vendor security programs. And what I see gelling really quickly is a combination of the software bill of materials concept and third-party risk management or vendor risk management programs coming together in a meaningful way in the next few months or years, such that we can manage this not only for our environments and our software in use within our environment, but also for our vendors out there.
Great to know, Saikas. Thanks for giving this new thing which is going in the market and the world and the listeners to know about it, like what is going to happen or what they need to be aware of. So as you brought up these new words, right, the software bill of materials, and incorporating that into CI/CD pipeline, right? The smaller companies like using 150 to 200 providers out there to build their code, build their application, and which has like 90% of reusable code. It seems like a supply chain type of scenario here, right? Like where people have different materials and then they assemble and make their own finished products, and then that goes out. Someone has to have that quality check. So in that regard, like I have read quite a bit about the supply chain security. I'm pretty sure you know quite a bit about it. So can you tell us like what is supply chain security? Like as people come to know more about that language or terms?
Sure, supply chain security it's actually a borrowed concept from manufacturing. When you think about it, manufacturing has been doing a bill of materials for a long period of time, primarily to ensure that they can have confidence about every component that goes into, say, building a car or building a machine or whatever, right? So from every nut bolt that goes into building an aeroplane, you have to have very high assurance that each of them are up to knot, as in they meet the quality standards that are required. Because even one bolt, breaking can create a huge risk for, say, aeroplane or a car or any such device. So the bill of materials has been around for quite some time, and it has blended itself really well to what we call the software bill of materials in the supply chain environment. So in a software supply chain, when you think about it, we are talking about small and large components of software being built by a variety of resources, including smaller players that sell their products and their components, as well as open source components that are publicly available out there. The challenge that the recent attacks that we have seen, like Solarwinds or Node IPC malware attack or Log4Shell, is that severe vulnerabilities like Log4Shell or malware like Node IPC can be introduced by people or third parties or malicious actors into this supply chain, and that can be used to compromise your system and then use it against you to get access to various critical parts of your ecosystem. Be it data, be it controls, be it configuration, be it API-based traffic, and that could be used against you. So what the industry has done is quickly reacted to it with this bill of materials kind of concept, where you can continuously, and you want to do this continuously, monitor what components are in use today in your environment, and if they are actually the components they are supposed to be, or have they been compromised. So this is another way of ensuring what we call software supply chain integrity, and making sure that no backdoors exist, no malware exists in the product that we have acquired from a third party to work in our environment.
Interesting. So just to recap for my understanding, what it means is like supply chain security, if you look from software perspective, is as you have different components and using off-the-shelf software components to build your applications, it does not mean that person might target your application itself. There may be a problem already existing in these off-the-shelf components, and that may just come in, and it will basically be a risk with respect to your application, which you might not have even known while you were building it, right?
Exactly.
So question, as you brought up this software bill of materials, and this concept of like getting everything together and then making sure that it is like threat-free or the risk is low. How do you develop and build a software bill of materials? Like what can be the way to, like, as I'm building an application, how do I build my software bill of materials to minimize the risk?
So there are a variety of tools that can be used. There are like some fairly well-known ones, like the Kubernetes Bill of Materials tool is one of them. And then there are other tools like SIFT and Turn and SPDX, bomb generator. So depending on your use case, you may want to go and figure out the right tool, including some of the open source tools that are out there, and introduce that into your CI/CD pipeline in a meaningful way, so that you can, every time that you look at new components or change components moving to your production environment, if you have this as part of the CI/CD pipeline, it automatically measures and makes sure that every subcomponent of this component that is being moved into production with its changes is appropriate and accurate, and there has been no issues with it. So that's how I would see companies doing this. Typically, introduce a software bill of materials tool to build a runtime software bill of materials, and use that as the first time you do that, use that as a baseline, and then any changes, we should make sure that is understood if there is any change to the software bill of materials. And if ideally there should be no changes, but if there are changes, it should be understood why there have been changes to it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I can. So question is, how easy is it to get started with it, right? Like, where do you introduce this, right? Like, it's a new thing. You have to now add another control or assessment list. So any guideline on regards to that? Like, is it a big project? Is it something a person can get started? Like some guidelines around that.
Sure. Talk to your developers to kind of, most of them would know something about it because it's a pretty hot topic out there. So that would be the first step. But when you talk to your developers, they will most probably tell you that these are the steps they would think of taking to make this happen, right? So within the CI/CD pipeline, what you will have to most probably end up doing is, look at what options you have. Say if you're a Jenkins shop, then Jenkins actually has a few plugins that you can think of that can generate a real-time software bill of materials for you and even baseline it for you. So you generate that, you baseline that, you keep it in a repository, a CVS or that kind of a version control repository where you can do compares really quickly, and then you automate the process that every time components flow through your CI/CD pipeline, you generate this and do a compare with the baseline version, see what changes are going through the environment. Now, if there is, you can even set up threshold values to what changes are allowed without further review and what changes require further review. Some companies, it depends on the risk tolerance of your company. Some companies may want to review all changes and ideally would like to look at no changes. Some will like to look at changes that are different from what has been projected by the developer because they are changing components. They may be swapping out a particular open source product with another, and they know that there would be a change. So it would be a quick review, and then mitigation would be like to sign it off, and the developer signs it off and it goes through. But if many companies say that they are surprised that sometimes they find things that were not supposed to be there. And sometimes they are genuine things because the underlying open source changed and they were not aware of it. But sometimes they may even hit malware or some other backdoors, which was intentionally put by a threat actor, and the systems were compromised. So having a process around that, if they hit the second part of the discussion that I had around threat actors, at that point, it's a flag to the security team to look at a better process, and they may start considering a better process on how software gets introduced, especially open source software gets introduced. They may consider investing in software composition analysis tools that have feeds from open source, projects so that they can do compares. Developers can do compares even before they start using a particular product and get assurance so that they don't get caught in the CI/CD pipeline, but they're caught earlier, and that they have assurance that they're using the right version of the open source that has been tried and tested. So it's an iterative process, Dheeraj. On day one, you start with a software bill of materials. That's a great start. And then you iterate to make it more mature by adding other components to it, by providing other tools to developers to get better access to safer components out there.
Awesome. So this brings up very logically the next question I had in the CI/CD pipeline as you're talking about. So a lot of it was like introducing this concept and the software associated, and it will start detecting stuff and it will start baselining, as you said. After you have baselined it, right? Like the next thing is to take an action, right? To basically correct it or mitigate the impact of the threat you have seen, right?
Yep.
So how do you secure the CI/CD pipeline by incorporating this supply chain controls? Like an example, like as you brought up the Jenkins thing, can you give us an example and then tell us the broad guidelines also, like how to put the controls into the place when you have seen a problem?
Sure. Few products are out there. Like if you use any of these products, as I said, and generate a SBOM and do a compare. The compare can be a manual step or it could be an API-driven step, depending on depending on the type of product. I don't want to promote any one product in this, so I'll keep product names out of it. But if you do the research, you will be able to find a set of automated products that can, through API calls, do a quick compare of the SBOM today with the baseline SBOM and spit out a JSON file or something similar that shows the differences. If there are no differences, you're good to go. If there are some differences, what companies typically do is trigger a ticket to the developer who has brought in the change, who is the owner of the change for that particular iteration, and triggering them to go and look at this file, do a compare, understand what changed, and kind of sign it off. So it's as simple as that. Once people do that, the developer kind of takes accountability for the change, and then we depending on the depth of practices that they have, the developer may want to do a thorough analysis using a software content analysis tool and put the results of that in the ticket to kind of promote why they are signing off on this ticket with the changes and why they can stand by the changes. Or if they actually end up finding an issue, they would notify the security team, open up a vulnerability or use a case or something of that sort, whatever they have, open up an issue with the security team for resolution and stop this from flowing into the production environment.
Got it. So it's a good point you brought up. Like generally it's the developer and the code, right, in which we are looking for this, and then we are basically fixing it, right?
Yeah.
What happens in the case like your application is already in production environment and you came to know, and how do you address such scenario in runtime, right? Like when your application is in production and you saw the problem.
I see what you're saying. Okay, so yeah, when your application is in production and you hit a problem, that's when it gets fairly interesting. So it depends on the severity of the problem. If it is if it is any of the recent ones that we saw, Node4j or Log4Shell issues, it could mean some really quick remediation that you may have to do, including segregating those components out and trying to continue business as usual if you can. That could be one option. The other could be looking for patches that have been released by various vendors, because as soon as these things become public, most vendors will react by generating a patch, and they will be sending you the patch, and or you could download it from them, or you could actually push the vendor for a patch. And ideally the patches that they give you would be applicable without having to take downtime. Now, if you have to take downtime, you just have, I guess at that point it's a business impacting scenario and it's pretty rough, but I guess it would mean that the benefits of taking the downtime outweigh the the cost of it. So you would do it. But those options, come up, and at that point you will kind of be leveraging your vendor. But what a solid, robust SBOM process does for you is lets you notify your vendors at times if they are not up to not, as to you see a change and you're not able to explain it, and is there an issue, and get some assurances from them. It's a good way for proactive security oriented companies to kind of deflect liability back to the vendors who are not up to not, and have them accountable to the process. So in production, if there's an issue, you see the response are not matching up, you have now a tangible artifact through the SBOM process to go back to the vendor and tell that vendor, hey, I see this difference. Can you explain it to me? I am not able to explain it. And you should investigate. And if required, you need to build a patch, because it looks like there's a vulnerability in your environment that we have to deal with now.
Got it. So in regards to the vendor, as you talked about, right? It's interesting. Like, so what should a person be looking in a vendor while they're doing a selection? Right. There is one part of like how good is their platform? Is there anything with respect to their processes, people, support? Like, how do you do an assessment on a technology partner? I just don't want to say vendor, but more of a technology partner, because they're part of your pipeline now, right? So
you're right. And to be very honest, all technology partners, aka vendors and other ecosystem players, partners, as well as sometimes even customers who are well integrated into your environment, have a role to play. And this is a very common thing that all of us know, but you are as good as your weakest link. So you don't want anybody in your ecosystem to be compromised or vulnerable, right? You want them to be up to a certain level of maturity in terms of their security and monitoring practices, so that they don't become the weakest link. So what to answer your question, there should be a robust vendor risk assessment process that factors in a whole bunch of things. And more importantly, as things around the software bill of materials get mature, we are seeing that companies requiring this kind of an assertion that they have a good sense of the software components in use within their products, and that this is monitored by their teams as a question that is coming up in vendor risk assessment scenarios, right? So the vendor risk assessment scenarios, which typically have been very reactive till today, typically vendor risk assessment, when you talk about it, people think about this huge questionnaire of things that somebody fails, and then people forget about it, and the product is used, and we forget about the patches that they're applying, the feature changes that they're bringing in, and things like that. That approach is going away. Also, lots of vendor risk assessment tools where outside in, so like some of the best known vendor risk assessment tools give you a score looking at things from outside. That approach is also fading out, and the new approach is to be inside out. So the vendors want to make sure that they are not the weakest link in your ecosystem, as well as much as you want them not to be the weakest link. So everybody is pushing to this place where they want to be stronger and be able to protect not only their products but their integrated ecosystem of services with other players in the mix. So I do foresee that all of this getting standardized into a risk ecosystem that talks to each other, provides scorecards and things like that to each other, and helps build confidence around the ecosystem about its ability to fend off attacks from malicious actors.
Got it, Sagar. I think so. This is interesting right now as we're going to the vendor side, right? Generally, when people start their journey on these cloud native applications, right, and the ones you have also worked in your experience, people generally start with open source software, right? Like people will go and look for something which has been powered by the community, contributed by the community, has been vetted out in mega scale deployments with the early innovators out there who are basically building totally a new type of applications or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So with respect to the open source software, right? what's the impact of a supply chain security on open source software security in a CI/CD pipeline?
When you think about open source software, it's perhaps the biggest blessing as well as the biggest curse. You have to kind of take it in that stride. And some of the most recent vulnerabilities that have come up also have demonstrated two core things. One of them is that open source runs the world. To your point, every company starts with something that is free or open because nobody wants to invest in, and rewriting a whole bunch of things that's already available. So that's one part of it. But the second thing that was an aha moment for the security practitioners, such as folks like me, is that we think open source to be this massive thing where lots of people are contributing, and it's not always the case. Most big open source projects, if you go down and see, have one or two main contributors.
Mm-hmm.
So if and it creates a huge risk at that point, because if a well distributed open source package has to be compromised, just think about it. If I'm a nation state and I want to compromise a well distributed open source package, I just have to work with one or two of the developers who have the biggest influence on that package to introduce something. So it's a risk at that point, and this is where being on top of what is going on even with your open source plays a big role. So you have to understand what version changes have happened. Do you need those version changes in your environment? Can you work with an earlier version? Many a times, backdoors and other things are introduced into software with this notion that it is a security patch. So you have to actually evaluate, is the patch a necessary security patch or not? So it gets a little complex, and that's where your security teams have to be more than just compliance focused folks. They have to be people. You have to have people who can get in the weeds and understand what is changing and how do you keep a tab on what is changing in your environment. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, Dheeraj.
No, it definitely brought a better view with respect to, like, okay, within the open source software, you need to look into like who are the ones who are contributing, right? And then how much distribution is there, how many security alerts or some type of flags have been raised for that software. And then moving forward from there, as people put in more security patches or try to make that software more secure, internally as a team, you have to basically evaluate, is that right thing for you or not? And if you have these 100 packages or 150 packages in your very small application, which is starting to grow, and out of that, even 20% are open source, you are basically talking about 20 to 30 type of software open source. So it's basically starts to balloon out in a fashion which becomes unmanageable. So you answered my question, but then now I have questions.
One other thing I want to point out, going back to the point that I was making, that it's one or two key contributors, but proactive security teams keep a tab on if the contributors are changing, and if the contributors have dramatically changed, have the original contributors completely abandoned the project and a whole bunch of new contributors have come in. That's the time when you have to take a really close look at that software and why the change is happening. So it takes a little, it's a lot of work at that point when you think about it. And at some point, I think there would be a product company out there who would do it and put a score of assurance on open source eventually, and which will be well consumed by the industry. But we don't have something like that today. So yeah.
Got it. So the question now I have is, as you talked about the software bill of materials, you talked about the security, who is in charge of like putting the supply chain security, like which team basically takes the lead in basically bringing this concept to the organization?
I think it's the combination of your development team. So your developers, maybe one of them would be a champion in this particular space. application security person, if you have one in your company, that, and an SRE or site reliability guy who runs your CI/CD pipeline and it does DevOps kind of work for you. So I would call it's a triad of these three stakeholders coming together and
Mhm.
owning this process. And different aspects of the process are for different people, right? So
Got it.
if you look at it, these are the three main players, but they have quick interfaces into vendor risk management folks, into legal,
Mhm.
into other folks, so that other risk mitigation folks, compliance folks, and risk mitigation folks, so that you can easily leverage these relationships to stop something bad from happening. If you have discovered something bad, you have to stop, and that may at times mean taking a feature outage, taking a short downtime. It could be a variety of things. So having people primed up to understand the importance of this and reacting to it is kind of important. And that's where you need a higher level stakeholder also to be behind this, like the CISO and the chief legal officer and folks like that, and the VP of engineering or CTO if you have one, or whatever you have in that role, to kind of understand what the risks can be if it is identified through this process, so that we can react to it.
Got it. Got it. I think so. That's interesting to know because we have a lot of listeners here who have the security background or who are basically coming from the platform side and then DevOps and SRE, because those roles have the security hat on as the teams are smaller in the smaller companies, and then the teams definitely grow up. So it's for everyone to look for and then start to look from different aspects. And as the organizations grow, you basically pick your area, specifically the regulation piece, the quality of the software piece, the security controls aspect, and from there you go.
Yeah,
So,
one other thing I would point out is in
mhm.
larger companies, there is generally a change control board, a release
Okay.
management team. They also get engaged in this because this is definitely a part of release management and change control. So,
Okay.
so they are like a degree of separation out. So the main folks, that these three folks would kind of them in to point out that there's an issue with this release and we have to stop the release, or and as part of release management activities, they would kind of look at what they need to do to kind of address an issue that has been discovered in this process.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really wonderful. Last question I have, because I think so we are up to the time now. How much time and resource a person should invest? And there are two types, right? One is I'm looking for is the person who is new to this, like has not run into problems, and now they're just looking at the next year and they are basically planning ahead. How much time and resource a team or an organization should put? And the second one is, what are the pointers for a person to look to start their journey internally or externally, right? Like you might not have hit that log4j problem, but you have heard a lot about it. Now you are like, internally it is not a threat, but externally you have heard a lot, right? So any pointers, right? Like what are the words you would like to listeners to leave here with?
So for the first group, which is the uninitiated trying to get initiated, this is the month of November and December. I think most companies are spending their time planning for next year, and budgets are getting decided and things like that. Keep a small project out there to understand what options make sense to further secure your supply chain. So keep a small line item for supply chain security out there is what I would say. It should show up in a CISO's budget. It should show up in the developers, org as well, and stakeholders that I mentioned, SRE developers and security folks. They should have this in their. In Salesforce, we call it V2 MOM or KPI or whatever it is. They should have a line item for this. This is kind of critical not only to plan for, but also to demonstrate to a variety of other external stakeholders that you care about this stuff. And that's kind of become very important, especially if you have any kind of federal relationship out there. It's required by the Biden executive order, and then lots of other large companies, banks, everybody will be asking you, what are you doing for supply chain security? So there should be a point of view on how you're securing your supply chain. That's one. For the initiated, you should think about how you can tie these into a coherent concept that produces reports and results that you can use to demonstrate your compliance to solid security, supply chain security principles. And that would mean like a repository of baseline, software bill of materials for your environment, a continuous process of checking against these baselines, and some history, an audit trail of how you dealt with situations when you found a difference between the baseline and what was being promoted into production. So that will show some maturity. And if you're already there, then even more, you can bring in a SCA or a software composition analysis tool, and do quarterly audits of your environment and make sure that not only the baselines are up to naught, but they're also exactly mapping up to what is available outside and under those versions and things like that. Proactive blue teaming exercise would be to make sure that you look at who are the biggest contributors to your software, inventory out there, and whether these contributors are changing, as I mentioned earlier, and how you can manage and understand the change in the open source ecosystem to most of the components that you use out there. So that along with, if by any chance there has been compromise in the last 6 months of any open source component, then this becomes even more important. Like, how do you react to it? You go back, you look at the SBOMs that you had created, how that changed, what patches should have gone in, retroactively go and fixing that, and pointing out how you reacted to this issue if public exposure gets out, around something that was compromised in a supply chain, like the Solarwinds issue or the Log4Shell issue, or any of these issues that we're talking about.
Thank you, Saigar. Thank you for this wonderful session. Thank you for this supply chain security session. Definitely, as always, it was great talking to you and learning about where security is going in future. And I hope the listeners also enjoyed the session and got pointers to get started, because this thing is going to become more important over the time. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone who joined us in the session. Feel free to drop us questions or send us a note with respect to if you want to know more about this stuff, and we'll be definitely able to help you with that.
All right. Thank you, Dheeraj. Thank you for having me over here. Bye.
Cloud-native applications can't be secured with the traditional security tools. You need a more active and granular level of security. Calico Cloud is an active cloud-native application protection platform that detects, prevents, and mitigates breaches in cloud-native applications. Let's look at how to secure your cloud-native environment at build time with Calico's container security. At build time, we want to make sure that images that the development team provides are clean and without major vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. All image registries are auto-populated and continuously